Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the 15th edition of Emanaciones Plotinianas. My name is Michael Chase. I am profesor invitado en el Departamento de Filosofía de la Universidad Panamericana, and I am also a researcher at the French National Centre of Scientific Research. I want to start by thanking Luis and Alexa for organizing this wonderful series of seminars. Like I say, this is the 15th one, and we've had 14 sessions prior to this of eminent scholars presenting very interesting talks, and so Alexa and Luis are rendering a very great service, I think, to Neoplatonic studies in general by organizing this seminar. So I think the first order of business is to say that this was originally what I'm going to be talking about now. The current research on the Plotiniana Arabica was initially conceived as a PowerPoint presentation. So now you are able to download that presentation, the PowerPoint, if you go to the comments section of the page that you're watching me on and click on the link for the PowerPoint. Okay, that's what I've been told you are supposed to do. I hope it works, because it will help if you're able to follow the presentation on PowerPoint. I'm going to be talking to I'm going to be mentioning a lot of names and words in Arabic, for instance, that perhaps not all of you are familiar with. So it would help if you have the PowerPoint before you. Okay, well, I think I will get started then. I do have quite a bit of material to cover. Oh, I should add that you are able to, during the presentation, you'll be able to answer questions in the form of comments. I will try to set aside some time at the end and answer as many of them as I can. Okay? Fair enough then. Right. We're going to be talking, as you can see on your slide 1, about the Plotinus apud Arabes current research on the theology of Aristotle and other Plotiniana Arabica. Now, despite its title, the Theology of Aristotle has nothing to do with Aristotle, but it consists in a paraphrastic Arabic translation of some extracts from books 4 to 6 of the Enneads of Plotinus, who, as we know, lived from about 204 to 270 of our epoch. Now, if you move to slide 2, please. When we speak of the Plotiniana Arabica, we're talking about the work called the Theology of Aristotle, which is the longest surviving work of this collection. There is also the Epistle of the Divine Science, originally attributed to Al-Farabi, but now has been discovered to be a part of this collection. Is also derives from the Enneads of Plotinus. And then we finally have the sayings of the Greek sage, Sheikh Yunani, who is usually considered to be Plotinus, although some have argued that instead he is Plotinus's student Porphyry. So when we speak of the Plotiniana Arabica, that's what we're going to be talking about. Okay? Now, so these 3 separate works are all thought to go back to an original Arabic translation of the Enneads of Plotinus. Was it complete? Was it restricted only to the last 3 Enneads? We don't really know. There's a lot we don't know about this translation, as you will see, as we will see. But this translation does not follow the order of the Enneads, as we know it today. It jumps from one portion of Plotinus's text to another and then back again, often within the same chapter. in a way that it seems at first glance to be completely chaotic and random. Also, within it, we sometimes have passages that are more or less a direct word-for-word translation, Arabic translation of the Plotinus's original Greek. But sometimes these are interspersed with passages, some of them which are quite long, which look more like explanatory comments, glosses, sometimes even some rather lengthy excursuses, which do not correspond to anything in Plotinus's text. So I'm particularly interested in these passages in the Theology of Aristotle, on which I'm going to concentrate today, which do not correspond to passages in Plotinus, because the question that arises is, where do they come from? Where do these explanatory paraphrases, comments, glosses, explanations, where do they come from? Who added them to the Theology of Aristotle? So now, the Platinia Arabica have been the subject of a lot of work over the past generation or so, a couple of generations, particularly by Cristina d'Ancona of Padova, Italy, who has a European Research Council project for a new critical edition of the Theology of Aristotle and has published a couple of volumes so far. One of the world's leading experts is Peter Adamson, who first began working in London and is now at Munich. But overall, there is an awful lot that we do not know about these works. If you want to turn now to slide 3 of the presentation, as far as the textual status of these works today is concerned, we have the Arabic text in a semi-critical edition published by Abd al-Rahman Badawi in 1955, Plotinus apud Arabes. Unfortunately, this book is awfully hard to get a hold of. I think I've only seen about 2 copies in my life. And it's also, while it's fairly good as far as its critical quality is concerned, since the time of Badawi's publication, we have discovered an awful lot more manuscripts of this work. I think at last count, Cristina d'Ancona had discovered over 150. And this reflects the fact that this work was enormously important in the Arabic tradition, not just in the West, among the falsafa, like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and so forth, but especially in the East, in Iran. In fact, people like Alain de Libera have shown that to a large extent the image of Aristotle that one has in Islamic philosophy, both in the East and in the West, as a Neoplatonist, is due precisely to the influence of this work, the Theology of Aristotle. Okay, on the next slide then, slide 4, we have, in addition to Badawi's critical edition, we have an excellent English translation, which is by Geoffrey Lewis, and it was published in Henri Schweitzer's Editio Maior of Plotinus's Enneads in Tome 2. And this translation by Lewis is almost equivalent to a critical edition, because he didn't just translate any extant edition, he actually went to the manuscripts and he consulted about a dozen of them. So his translation tends to be probably more reliable than Badawi's edition. Now the problem is that Lewis conceived his translation to shed light on Plotinus's Enneads. And so the translation is arranged in facing pages with the portions of the Enneads that they are reflecting. This is very interesting, of course, but it makes it almost impossible to read the Theology of Aristotle from beginning to end as the way it was intended to be read, the way all Islamic commentators read it and commentated on it for hundreds and hundreds of years. So one of my current projects, I'm very, very slowly working on, is a new English translation of the Theology of Aristotle, which will respect the way the work appears in the Arabic manuscripts we have. Okay, in your slide 5 here is just for illustrative purposes. This is a folio from the best manuscript of the Theology of Aristotle, the Hagia Sophia 2457, copied in 1459, which was not sufficiently taken into account by Badawi. So we need a new edition, and then Christina D'Ancona is working on that, as I mentioned, and I wish her the best of luck. So, Plotinus and the Plotiniana Arabica, in slides 6 and 7. The Plotiniana Arabica provide a fascinating insight into how Arabic-speaking readers understood the text of Plotinus in the early 9th century of our era. And they enrich our understanding of both Greek and Arabic philosophical terminology. Because just as Cicero did for Latin, the translators of these works were faced with the task of really creating a new Arabic vocabulary, an Arabic philosophical vocabulary which would transmit the thought of Plotinus. And I am always, when I read these translations of Plotinus, I am amazed at the importance, the impressive nature of this intellectual accomplishment, that they were able to read these difficult works in Greek and in ancient manuscripts in majuscule, where there will be all capital letters, no division between the Greek words, no accents. They were able to read this work from the manuscript, understand it, translate it, and occasionally even make it more comprehensible than the original. So every time I read them, I say, hats off. Wonderful accomplishment. If we move now to slide 7. So who are the philosophers who were initially influenced by the Theology of Aristotle and the other Plotiniana Arabica? Well, we have 3 main names here. Al-Kindi, who lived from 801 to 873. Al-Farabi, who lived from 872 to 950 roughly. And a bit later on, we have the famous Avicenna, Ibn Sina in Arabic, who lived from 980 to 1037. So, as I said, these works can also be viewed as, even today, as a help for understanding Plotinian passages. I'm going to skip over a little bit of material here, and this for the sake of time, where I give an example of the different interpretation, the Arabic interpretation as opposed to the original Greek of Plotinus. And I'm going to move on to discuss the background of the Greco-Arabic translation movement as a whole. What works were translated from Greek into Arabic, and when and why, to a certain extent. So for those of you who have the PowerPoint, we're going to jump a little bit here to slide 10, the slide that says the Greco-Arabic translation movement. And it shows, just as an example, some of the equivalents of dictionaries that these scholar translators would have used. You have a manuscript here, which has the Greek in the majuscule, what's called the Anshal script on the left, and on the right you have the Arabic, which provides a translation of these key terms. So, the Plotiniana Arabica were translated into Arabic, probably directly from the Greek, and now Greek texts that arrived in Arabic usually first were translated into Syriac, and then from Syriac into Arabic. But this doesn't appear to be the case here. It seems as though the Plotiniana Arabica were translated directly from the Greek into Arabic. This translation took place in the second quarter of the 9th century of our period. Now, by this time, there had already been a lengthy translation of contact between Arabs with Greek thought. Islamic contact with Greek thought had begun shortly after the Arabic conquest of Syria in 635 and the establishment of the Umayyad Caliphate at Damascus in 661. But even by then, the Syrians, that is to say, those who spoke Syriac, had long been acquainted with Greek learning, especially logic, cosmology, and medicine, but also metaphysics. Go to your slide 11 now. An example of this is Sergius of Resh-Aina, who died in 536. He translated Aristotle's Organon into Syriac. He translated more than 30 works by Galen. He himself was a doctor. And he also translated works by the pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, who, as we know, adopted the metaphysical system and the vocabulary of Proclus. In fact, he did this translation probably very soon after the works of the pseudo-Dionysius were first written down. Now, other works that were translated from the 6th to the 8th centuries of our period, translated into Syriac, include works on Aristotelian logic, ethics, psychology, alchemy, gnomologies, that is to say, collections of brief sayings. And during this period, there seem to have been important philosophical libraries in a lot of places in the Near East. You can see here on your slide 12. There were libraries at Apamea, Haran in Syria and Mesopotamia, in the Gaza Strip of Egypt, at Marsaba in Palestine. Now, if those of you who can see your slide 12, you'll see right in the middle of the screen, above where it says Osroene in large print, there's the little town of Haran, which in the time we're talking about would have been right on the border between what was the Roman Empire and what was the Persian Empire, and that is to say, in the 6th century before the Islamic conquest. And we will be returning to the importance of Haran a little bit later on. It was the home of this mysterious group, ethnico-religious cultural group known as the Sabians. And we will come back to them. So, slide 13. After the Arab conquest, we have the Caliph Muawiyah, ruled from 661 to 680, who already orders translations of works on alchemy. So these translations of alchemical works are among the first Greek works to be translated into Arabic. Later on, the Caliph Hisham, who rules from 724 to 43, orders translations of Greek works on ethics, politics, cosmology. That includes the De Mundo, pseudo-Aristotelian, apocryphal correspondence from Aristotle to Alexander the Great, who was his student, on royalty, the art of governing, the art of war, all themes that were common to the literary genre known as the specula principis, the mirror of the prince. Under the Abbasids, as we see in your slide 14, who ruled from 750 to 1258, we have translations of Euclid, Ptolemy, Nicomachus of Gerasa on mathematics, and epitomes of Aristotle's Organon under the Caliph al-Mansur, 754 to 775. Later on, under al-Mahdi, who ruled from 775 to 785, we have a translation of Aristotle's Topics. But the real culmination of this early translation movement comes under the Caliph al-Ma'mun, who ruled from 813 to 833 of our era. And the legend goes that al-Ma'mun saw a vision of Aristotle in a dream, and Aristotle said, "Get to work translating my works." And the story goes, al-Ma'mun did so. Slide 15, one of the institutions that was important in this translation movement was called the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, literally. founded by the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who reigned from 786 to 809. So, now, scholarly opinion differs as to what exactly this institution was. According to someone like Dimitri Gutas, it was an institution devoted to translating basically Persian material on the history of, and doctrines and beliefs of Persia, poetic material. That's Gutas. Another point of view, held by Gerhard Endres and Christina d'Ancona, holds that it was a veritable research center on the natural sciences, astronomy, astrology, mathematics, and philosophy. I don't have the competence to decide which of these views is actually correct, but I do want to mention one fact that may support Christina d'Ancona's view, and this is your slide number 16. We know, or at least we are told by the tradition, that the Byzantine emperors organized expeditions. I'm sorry, I restart. The Islamic caliphs organized expeditions from Baghdad to the Byzantine Empire in search of Greek manuscripts. One such expedition was ordered by Al-Ma'mun, probably during the reign of the Byzantine Emperor Leon V the Armenian, who reigned from 813 to 820. They went to Byzantium. They brought back manuscripts that included texts by Plato, Aristotle, Hippocrates, Galen, Euclid, Ptolemy, and others. And one of the members of this expedition was a man named Salman, who was the head of the Beit al-Hikmah. So this sort of lends credence to the idea that the Beit al-Hikmah was indeed, at least partly, devoted to the translation of Greek scientific and philosophical works into Arabic. Now, your slide 17 is just another map showing basically where some of these places are: Alexandria, Baghdad, Antioch in Syria, Haran. Now, although these expeditions from Baghdad to the Byzantine Empire no doubt enriched the collections of the Beit al-Hikmah, there will probably have been the exception rather than the rule. The Arabs themselves spoke of a continuous philosophical tradition, a transmission of Greek learning from Alexandria to Antioch, which is now in Turkey, Antioch to Haran, this place on the border between the Roman and the Iranian Empire, which we mentioned earlier, and then Haran to Baghdad. Now, modern historians, according to people like Dimitri Gutas, think that this is all a myth. It's just a fabulation invented after the fact. But I think there will have been some truth to it. Now, a more controversial hypothesis is the one that has been put forward by Aristotle Hadot, and who is following this Michel Tardieu. And they point out that when the Emperor Justinian ordered all pagan Neoplatonic schools to be closed in the Byzantine Empire, including the school of Athens, the last Greek Neoplatonic philosophers emigrated to the court of the Persian king. Khosroes the first, and this happened in the early 530s of our time. So, Tardieu, followed by Aristotle Hadot, said, we know that these guys our evidence tells us that they spent a couple of years at the court of the Persian king. They were disappointed, they left, and that's all we know. That's all our sources tell us. Now, what Tardieu and Hadot think is that after they were at the court of the king of Persia, these last Neoplatonists moved to Haran, and they established a school there, which played a very important part in transmitting Greek philosophy to Islam. Okay, this is a very controversial hypothesis. I think it's safe to say that among scholars, it's the minority view. Most people don't think that that's correct. I will remain agnostic about it. But I've recently come up with another hypothesis which is not contradictory with the Tardieu Hadot hypothesis. So what I've suggested is that when these last 7 Neoplatonists go to Persia, I don't believe that they would have gone with just their shirts on their backs. I think that they may have taken with them part of the library of the school of Athens. Now, this is your slide, 18, by the way. So here they go, these 7 Neoplatonists. They arrive at this court of Chosroes, and Chosroes, the Persian king, had a reputation, even in the Greco-Roman world, of being really interested in Greek philosophy and of translating, having his scribes and his intellectuals translate everything they could get their hands on. So assuming that these Neoplatonists did take with them to the court of the king of Chosroes some of the manuscripts of the library of the school of Athens, well, I suggest, why can we not assume that Chosroes may have had some of these works translated into Persian? Now, the manuscripts that he might have translated include ones containing the works of Damascius, of Proclus, perhaps of Simplicius as well. And since in the 8th and the 9th centuries of our era, most of the intellectuals in this early period of Islam were bilingual in Persian and in Arabic, we can suggest perhaps that some elements of Greek philosophy became known to the very early Islamic scholars and philosophers in this way. So that's my hypothesis. You can read the article and tell me what you think. Slide 19 speaks of some other possible avenues of transmission. We know that some Platinian material was translated to Syriac as early as the 680s, and under the early Abbasid Empire, Christian libraries continued to flourish in places like Alexandria, Antioch, and Edessa. These libraries will have preserved Greek manuscripts and translated them into Syriac. And there were also monastic libraries, not just in Syria, but also in Palestine, in places like Eusebona, Terada, Keneshre, Katmin, where monks who were often working in the Origenist tradition, that is to say, they were followers of Origen and Evagrius of Pontus, may have preserved Greek manuscripts down to the 9th century. So, someone who was interested in Plotinus may not have had to go all the way to the Byzantine Empire. They might have had to only just gone to the nearest monastery in Syria or Palestine, and there may have been manuscripts of Plotinus in some of these monasteries. But much more work needs to be done on this whole question of Greco-Syriac translations in Palestine and Syria. So much for the availability of Plotinian manuscripts at the time. Who did the translations? Well, it was done by the circle of Al-Kindi, as you see on your slide 20th. Abu Yusuf Yaqub bin Ishaq Al-Kindi, who died in 870 and is usually considered to be the first Islamic philosopher, as we understand the term philosophy. So, what did Kindi do? Well, probably on the orders of the Caliph al-Ma'mun, he organized a circle of translators. This is your slide number 21, to get to work translating some Islamic philosophy. So we know that an Arabic-speaking Greek by the name of Eustathius, Ustad in Arabic, translated the metaphysics and the Nicomachean ethics into Arabic. We know that Yahya al-Bitrik, which means son of the patrician, the Patricios, translated Aristotle's De Caelo, Meteorology, Parts of Animals, Generation of Animals. And from this same circle, we also have anonymous translations of Aristotle's Parva Naturalia, De Anima, some works by Alexander of Aphrodisias, And perhaps most importantly, we have an Arabic adaptation of some works, of some propositions from Proclus's Elements of Theology. And these propositions from Proclus were transformed into a book which was entitled Kitab al-Khair al-Mahd, the Book of the Pure Good. And while this seems to have a fairly limited influence on Islamic thought, when it was translated into Latin in the medieval period, under the title of the Book of Causes, Liber de Causis, it became tremendously influential on subsequent Latin scholastic thought. Commentaries were devoted to it by Albertus Magnus, Thomas Aquinas, and literally hundreds of other Latin scholars of the 13th and 14th centuries. I'm not an expert on this work. The world's greatest expert on this work is my friend and colleague Richard Taylor, along with Christina D'Ancona. So, in this sense, this first wave of Islamic translations is more interested in Neoplatonism than the later wave of Islamic translations around people like Hunayn ibn Ishaq and his son Ishaq ibn Hunayn, who were probably the better known translators, and they concentrated on Aristotle and Galen, although they did also translate a lot of Alexander of Ephrodisias. Okay, so let's move on now to the preface of the Theology of Aristotle. This is your slide number 22. So in my translation, it reads, the first mima, the first chapter or section of the book of the philosophy of Aristotle that is called in Greek Theology. It is the discourse on divine sovereignty. Commentary, tafsir, by Porphyry of Tyre. Translated into Arabic by Abd al-Masih ibn Abdallah ibn Na'im al-Himsi, corrected for Ahmad ibn al-Muttasim Billah by Abu Yusuf ibn Ishaq al-Kindi. May God have mercy upon him. So, this little preface gives us an awful lot of important information. We learned the translator from Greek into Arabic of this work was Ibn Na'ima al-Himsi, who was a Syrian Christian. We learn that al-Kindi corrected, or another translation would be edited, this work. And we learned that he did so for Ahmad ibn Muttasim Billah, who was the son of the Caliph al-Muttasim, who reigned between 833 and 842. So there, that allows us to have a quite precise dating of this work, the date when this work was translated. However, this preface also raises as many questions as it answers. Here we have this work, which we saw derived from Plotinus, attributed to Aristotle. Okay, well, what's happening here? Who made this attribution? Was it a mistake? Or was it a deliberate instance of forgery? I think it probably was a case of forgery. I think perhaps Kindi, in his guise as the editor of this work, for reasons of his own, decided to make his audience believe that this work is actually by Aristotle and not by Plotinus. Perhaps because just questions of prestige. Aristotle by this time was already known as the greatest of philosophers in the Arabic world. Second, what the second of the questions that is raised by this work is, what about its chaotic nature? Why does it jump all over the place instead of giving us a translation of the Enneads, beginning with the beginning and going until one comes to the end? Now, one of the leading scholars on this theology of Aristotle, Fritz Zimmermann, proposed what has been called the Big Bang hypothesis. He imagined that there was a more or less complete translation into Arabic of Plotinus's Enneads, that somehow the manuscript fell apart. There's the Big Bang involved. It exploded. And then somebody came along later, found these loose sheaths of paper, and just stuck them together pretty well any old way. So this is this is perhaps the leading hypothesis as to how the theology of Aristotle as we now have it came about, by accident. Others, like Christina Dancona, say, no, that's not true. There is, in fact, an underlying logic and structure to the way the theology of Aristotle has been arranged. It's not easy to see. You have to look very carefully. Finally, there's the question of authorship. As I mentioned, the main question in my mind is, who is the author of these passages where the theology of Aristotle differs from what Plotinus has to say? There are three basic hypotheses here, and this is your slide number 23. Who's responsible? Well, Zimmerman and Adamson say it was the translator himself, Ibn Naima al-Hinsi. Problem is, we know nothing about him. Did he have the necessary philosophical abilities, not just to translate, but also to carry out the editing process and to insert these explanatory passages? I'm not so sure. The other hypothesis is that it was Al-Kindi himself who inserted them, and this is quite a possible hypothesis. But there's another possibility, and that is that the original source of these intercalations, these insertions of non-Plotinian material into the theology of Aristotle, goes back in some way or another to Porphyry of Tyre. That was the view of the late Pierre Hadot, and it's also my view. So I'm going to try to show why I think that way in what follows. And in order to do so, I'm going to be concentrating on some characteristic doctrines that feature in the theology of Aristotle, but do not feature in the thought of Plotinus, or at least not to the same extent. So we'll start off and in our discussion of these principles with slide 24, designations of the first principle. Now, the Plotinia Arabica contains several doctrines that are absent from Plotinus himself, and one is the nature of God or the first principles. In these Arabic works, the first principle, the highest principle, is referred to as being. Al-Aniyya, Al-Huwiyya, or Al-An in Arabic. And these expressions are the ones that are elsewhere used to translate the Greek ta'on, the participle for being, or the existent, or ta'enai, the infinitive, which means to be or to exist. Now, as we know, for Plotinus, the first principle is not being at all. The first principle is beyond being for Plotinus. Whereas for Porphyry, Plotinus' student, at least in his commentary on the Parmenides, which Pierre Hadot believed is by Porphyry, and I believe he's correct. In this commentary on the Parmenides, we find that the first principle is no longer the one, but it is ta enai, being itself or existence. It is a verb, and in the infinitive, without a subject. Another of these features that are unique to the Plotiniana Arabica, and that is the doctrine of creation by mere being. Aotoi toi enai in Greek, this is your slide 25, and in Arabic, bi eniyati faqat. Now, according to this doctrine, God, or the first principle, creates the world by virtue of his mere existence, his mere being. Just the fact that he is suffices for the world to be created. There does not have to be any act or choice of will on the part of the creator. And there's a text that we find here in your slide 25 from Mimar, that is to say, chapter 10 of the Theology of Aristotle. It is impossible for us to say, we read there, that the Creator first reflected over how to originate things, and then, after that, originated them. He does not need reflection in creating things, because he is the things, by virtue of their being, their cause. And this doctrine is backed up in our slide 26, I believe it is. Yes, slide 26 from one of the sayings of the Greek sage. Here we read, "The first agent must be at rest and unmoved, since it is necessary that his action be without deliberation, motion, and volition, inclining toward the effect." So, this is an interesting doctrine. Why would anybody come up with this strange doctrine that creation in this way is, in a sense, automatic? It's not intentional. It's not accompanied by thought or reflection. Well, I think that this doctrine was designed to avoid the difficulties raised by a certain number of pagan opponents of the doctrine of creation of the world in time. And in your slide 27, you see that these main questions are, first of all, what was God doing before he created? And secondly, why did God create at a specific moment in time and not earlier or later? As far as what was God doing before he created is concerned, this was an argument that pagan adversaries of Christianity often came up with. They said, well, so God, there was a long period of time, presumably an infinite period of time, when God did not create. So what was he doing during this time? Was he asleep or what? At any rate, he must have been idle. But if his essence is to be good, and being good implies granting being on other things, well, how could God exist without creating? How could he still be God if he isn't creating? Is it because he was jealous, miserly, impotent, too weak to create, or all three? So obviously no monotheist, pagan, Christian, Islamic, or any other kind could possibly admit any of those possibilities. As far as the creation of why did he create at a specific time and not earlier or later? Obviously, in the Christian tradition, later scholars figured out that they could specify the exact time in history at which God created the universe. Much later on, it was worked out to be about 6,000 years ago. But the pagans responded to this Christian doctrine by saying, so what's going on here? Why did he choose precisely that moment to create? Did he change his mind? Did he switch from spending an eternity deciding not to create till all of a sudden it came into his mind, well, hey, I think I'm going to create the universe? How can we possibly attribute such a change of mind, such a mutability to God? And your slide 28 here shows that the doctrine of creation by being alone, not by being alone, no, estando solitarios, but por el ser, por la existencia misma, بأنية فقط, this doctrine fulfills several other functions as well. It eliminates the need for reflection, will, and choice on the Creator's part, which all imply damage to the thesis of divine simplicity and immutability. Because if we think that God first has to reflect, exercise will, exercise choice before he creates, then this can be considered as something intervening between God and his creation, interrupting the immediacy of his relation to them. And equally importantly, all these factors imply motion on the part of God. And we don't want there to be any motion in the part of God, in God, as we shall see. So here's another of these doctrines that are in the Platonia Arabica and not elsewhere. This is your slide number 29, and it deals with the doctrine of instantaneous creation. So, in the Platonia Arabica, God, or the first principles, creates by means of simple, unitary, non-discursive knowledge. And we can see this from our quote here, from the 10th Mimar of the Theology of Aristotle. Here we read, every science and every wisdom and everything were all originated at once, daf'atan wahidatan, which corresponds to the Greek athroos, all at once, simultaneously, without reflection or thought, la bi rawiyati wa la fikrin, because their originator was one and simple, originating the simple things, that is to say the Platonic ideas presumably, all at once, daf'atan wahidatan, by his being alone, bi annihi faqat. So, this text, and there are many others like them, introduces a close link between at least three elements: the doctrine of creation by being alone, the doctrine of creation without reflection of thought, and the doctrine of instantaneous creation, as we see in our slide 30. So, this doctrine, as we saw, maintains that God creates all things at once, instantaneously. Daf'atan wahidatan athroos. As we read in a fragment from the sayings of the Greek sage, we say that the first being performs all his actions all at once. And according to the Theology of Aristotle, this instantaneous mode of creation by the first being is quite different from the way that the intellect, which is the first thing that God creates is the intellect, and then the intellect goes on to do its own creation, creates the rest of the world. It creates the soul, and the soul creates the world. But the way that intellect creates is very different from the way that God creates. As we can see here in our extract from the 8th chapter, the 8th Mimar of the Theology of Aristotle, the intellect is the maker of things, but it makes them one after another in succession and order. Okay, so there's the key difference. God makes everything all at once. Boom! The intellect, however, has to make things one after the other. As for the first agent, we read, he makes all the things he makes without an intermediary, b'ghayri tawasutun, simultaneously, ma'an, and all at once, fidafati wahidatan. And the connection between these doctrines is further explained in our slide 31 by a fragment from the sayings of the Greek sage. Here we read that for creation to take place, the first agent, that is to say God, transmits the forms, the Platonic ideas, to the intellect, which then hands them over to soul, which inserts them within matter, and that's just what creation is. But this creation does not take place in time. It takes place instantaneously. Daf'atan wahidatan. Now, the author seems to be trying to prove this by an argument a contrario. He's saying, if this was not the case, let's assume for a second that God's creation was not instantaneous. Well then, it is argued, if that was the case, the first agent's act would be partial and fragmentary. Unmanifested acts would still remain within him. It would, at any given time, there would be some stuff that he'd already created, other stuff inside him that he had not created. But if that is the case, our author argues, that means that he would not be making things by his being alone, bi anniha faqat, but he would be using reflection and motion, rawiyati wa harakati ma, and that is absurd. So, this doctrine, this conjunction of doctrines is, as we can see, all interlinked. Slide 32, the doctrine of instantaneous creation, the doctrine of creation by being alone, the doctrine of creation without motion on the part of the creator, and the doctrine of creation without reflection of deliberation. They're all involved, imbricated in a mutually supportive complex of ideas. They all reinforce one another. So let's assume that this is more or less on the right track. Where did the author come up with these ideas? One might ask. Well, I think he mainly came up with them from the Greek Neoplatonic philosophical tradition. And we'll start off here with slide 33. We're going to talk about Proclus. Proclus has a work entitled On the Eternity of the World. And in this work, the fourth argument, he sets out the following argument. He starts off with the idea that change is motion. Fair enough. Everyone would agree, I think. But now, according to Aristotle in the Physics, motion is defined as an incomplete actuality. So, Proclus argues that means if God changed, he would proceed from imperfection to perfection. He would start off being imperfect, and by virtue of motion, he would reach perfection. But this, Proclus argues, is unacceptable. We cannot conceive that the highest principle, God, is in any way imperfect at any time, and therefore it follows that God does not change. So, this doctrine, we've spoken of the doctrine of creation by being alone, and Christina d'Ancona, who believes that it comes from the pseudo-Dionysius, points out that this is a very important feature in the thought of the pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite. And that's true enough, but it's also true that already in the thought of Porphyry, we encounter the same principle. And here's in our slide number 34, we have a rather long quotation, which I'm going to read because it's very important. Fourth and next, and this is Proclus who's writing in his commentary on the Timaeus. Fourth and next is the section of Porphyry's arguments in which he shows that the divine intellect practices a mode of creation, demiurgia, by mere being, or by being alone, autoi toi enai. He establishes this, Porphyry does, by a series of arguments. Even artisans, he says, need tools for their activity because they do not have mastery over all their material, over all their hyle. They show this themselves by using these tools to get their material ready for use, euergos, by drilling, planing, or turning it, all of which operations do not add form, but merely eliminate the unreadiness of what is to receive the form. And here is the idea of, we recall the passage from Plotinus' Enneads, where he says, never stop sculpting your own statue. The idea being that in ancient Greek art, the form, the beautiful form, is already present in the statue. And what a sculptor does, all a sculptor does, is he removes extraneous matter. So sculpting your own statue means getting rid of extraneous matter, and then the natural beauty that is in you already will come to the surface. In the same way here, all craftsmanship is conceived of as removing excess stuff. And that's what these references to drilling, planing, and turning are meant to convey. They just eliminate unreadiness, right? Eliminate inappropriate things. The actual rational formula, the logos, on the other hand, Porphyry continues, supervenes upon the substrate, the hypokemenon, timelessly, achronos, from the art, once all the obstacles have been removed. So here's the idea is that a craftsman has to remove obstacles from his material. But that takes time. If you're God, then for you there are no obstacles to your creation. You don't have to do any of these mechanical operations in order to get the material ready. Therefore, first of all, you don't need any tools, and secondly, you don't need any time. No obstacles to remove, no time necessary to remove the obstacles. Therefore, Porphyry says, if there were no obstacle in the case of artisans either, they would add the form to the matter instantaneously and have absolutely no need of tools. right? So even a human craftsman building a statue, for instance, if he didn't have any matter to deal with, if he didn't have to disengage the form from the statue, then all he would have to do is think, and boom, we would have a statue. He would impose the form on the matter instantaneously. He can't do that because he's immortal and he's working in the material world, which presents obstacles to form, resistance. God doesn't have that problem, and so his creation is instantaneous. Okay? So, this is Proclus, writing obviously in the 5th century in Greek. At a little bit earlier, in the Latin-speaking world, we have the testimony of St. Augustine, who says things that are fairly similar, and it looks as though he is responding to pagan objectors to Christianity, and scholars have shown, and I agree, that it's very, very likely that the people Augustine is responding to here include primarily Porphyry. All right, so here's Augustine in your slide 35, who is responding to objections against the Christian doctrine of creation and time. Here's what the pagans object to the Christians. But why did the eternal God decide to make heaven and earth at that particular time and not before? We've already seen this problem here. Why did God create at the time he did and not earlier or later? Augustine goes on to say, there are some who admit that the world is created by God, but refuse to allow it a beginning in time, only allowing it a beginning in the sense of its being created. Non tamen eum temporis volunt habere, sed suae creationis initium. So that creation becomes an eternal process, semper sit factus. There is force in that contention. This is a reasonable idea, says Augustine, in that such people conceive themselves to be defending God against the notion of a kind of random fortuitous act, velut a fortuitate meritate defendere. So what these pagans were motivated by when they came up with this doctrine of continuous creation is that they wanted to avoid the idea that God might change his mind. God does not change his mind, ever. What they wanted to do, Augustine says, was to prevent the supposition that the idea of creating the world suddenly came into his mind as an idea which had never before occurred to him, and that a new act of will happened to him, et accidisse idli voluntatem novam. Whereas in fact, says Augustine, he is not at all subject to change. Exactly the point of view of Proclus later on. We cannot imagine that God changes or changes his mind. Augustine continues in our slide number 36. He says, and once again, reflecting the arguments of the pagans, and here we're coming now to the question of the interpretation of Plato's Timaeus. As we know, Plato's Timaeus, around about 28 B7 following, seems to say that yes, when the demiurge created the world, he did so in time. The question is explicitly raised in the Timaeus. Was the world eternal, or did it come to be? Did it come into existence, gegonen? And Plato's answer there is gegonen. It came to be. So Augustine says, however, Plato openly says both of the world and of what he writes as the God in the world made by God, that they began to exist. This reflects the gegonen of the Timaeus, and to have a beginning, habere initium. But by the most powerful will of the God, he testifies that they will remain for eternity. We remember that passage in the Timaeus where Plato says, yes, the demiurge is saying to the lesser gods, I have created you, but because of my goodwill, I will never let you perish. You would perish if it wasn't for me, but I'm not going to let you do so. Yet they, Augustine says, that is to say the Platonists, found a way to understand this, i.e. that it is not a beginning of time, but of subsistence. Non esse hoc videdicit temporis sed substitutionis initium. And by this odd word substitutio, I think Augustine is translating the original Greek hypostasis. Etymologically, it makes sense. Sub equals hypo. Stitio more or less means stasis, standing. both of them mean something standing under something else, right? And then Augustine gives a very interesting and example, which is going to be very influential in the history of Latin thought. He gives the example of a foot that is in a pile of dust from eternity, right? Let's say there was an eternal foot in an eternal pile of dust. If that was the case, then a footprint would always be under it, yet no one would doubt that the footprint was made by someone treading. So you see the effect in this process. You see the footprint. You assume that there is a cause, the foot, necessarily. So they say, both the world and the God created within it always existed, since he who made them always exists, and yet they were made. So here the point is, you see an eternal foot impressing a footprint on an eternal pile of dust. You can see, you can deduce, you cannot fail to deduce that this effect, the footprint, has a cause, the foot. However, you are not entitled to deduce that there was a moment in time in which the cause existed, the foot existed, and the footprint did not exist. Both can have existed for eternity. So this is really a definition of the doctrine of eternal creation. And what the doctrine of eternal creation denies is that in every single process, the cause has to precede the existence of the effect. Not at all. Say the Neoplatonists who came up with this idea, there can be causal processes where the cause does not precede the effect temporally. It precedes it only ontologically in the system of according to its worth or its ontological value. And this is the doctrine of creation, as the Greeks would say, kat aitian, according to cause. Okay? Now, if there was any doubt that this is Porphyry, I think it is eliminated by another text we have, your slide 37, which is preserved only in Arabic, in the Persian historian Sharastani, who lived in the 13th century. And this fragment goes as follows. And he, Porphyry, claimed that the statement attributed to Plato considering the world's coming to being is not correct. He said in his letter to Anibo, this is going to be important, this is slide 37, by the way, it's going to be important that this quotation of Porphyry is attributed to the letter to Anibo. Porphyry is supposed to have said, what separates Plato from you, viz. That he gives the world a temporal beginning, that is to say that he makes the world begin in time, is a lie. It's a mendacious assertion. This is because Plato did not think that the world had a temporal origination, but an origination with regard to a cause. Which corresponds precisely to the Greek formulation aitia, causation kat aitian. And he claimed that the cause of its existence is its origination. He, Porphyry, was of the opinion that whoever imagined that Plato's view was that the world was created, and that it had come into being ex nihilo, la min shai in Arabic, and that it had emerged from disorder into order, such a person is just wrong. Such a person has erred and been deluded. For, and here's the key, it is not always true that non-existence precedes existence in time. By saying that the Creator made the world come forth from non-existence into existence, Plato merely meant that it does not exist by itself, but the cause of its existence comes from its Creator. Okay, so what I think is important when we compare these two texts is that we see that what's at issue here is that Porphyry is saying Plato did not teach in the Timaeus that the world is created in time, contrary to what the Christians say and what some Neoplatonists like Plutarch and Atticus said. If Plato seems to say that the world is created, what he in fact all he means, in fact, is that the world depends on a cause. But Porphyry insists, just because the world depends on a cause does not mean that this causal relation has to be temporal. So, as we saw, according to Sherastany, Porphyry backs up his assertion by remarking that it is not always true that non-existence temporally precedes existence. And this seems to me to be exactly the same point that Augustine was making, or rather that Augustine's opponents were making, by making their example of an eternal foot, making an eternal footprint in eternal dust. Just because we see a footprint in the dust, we are not entitled to assume that the cause, the foot in this case, is prior to its effect, the footprint, in time. It can be prior to it in other ways, but doesn't have to be prior to it in time. All right, so one further element of correspondence here is a passage from the Theology of Aristotle. And this is your text number 38. Here we read, how well and how appropriately does this philosopher, and it's obvious from the context that he's talking about Plato, describe the Creator when he says he created mind, soul, nature, and all things else. But whoever hears the philosopher's words must not pay attention to the letter of the words and imagine that he said that the Creator created the creation in time. So here we go again, precisely what we've seen in the last two quotations. What's going on here is a response to people who say, looky here, and this is what John Plotinus, for instance, said, the Christian Neoplatonist, looky here, Plato says in the Timaeus, the world was created in time. So there. Wait a second, says the author here. He may say that, but let me tell you what he actually meant. If anyone imagines that, says the author of the Theology of Aristotle, from his mode of expression, Plato's mode of expression, he merely expressed the will to follow the custom of the ancients. So he was trying to explain Plato in a way that his readers would understand, just a way of speaking. The ancients were compelled to mention time in connection with the beginning of creation because they wanted to describe the creation of things. And they were compelled to introduce time into their description of becoming and into their description of the creation, which was not in time at all, in order to distinguish between the exalted first causes and the lower secondary causes. But this is not so, says the author. Not every agent performs his action in time, nor is every cause prior to its effect in time. Okay? There, I think, is the kicker. I think this is precisely the point, precisely the same argumentation that we have seen in our two preceding texts. One of them attributed to Porphyry by the Arabic author Sherastany. One of them attributed by Augustine to his pagan opponents, one of whom is almost certainly Porphyry. So we have a pretty, I think, important confirmation here that there is something important in common between the doctrine of Porphyry, attested from Greek, Latin, and Arabic sources, and the doctrine of the Theology of Aristotle. Okay, let's be more specific. Let's assume for a moment then that this does not prove, but at least gives us a presumption that maybe Porphyry had something to do with the fabrication of the Theology of Aristotle. How might this concretely have worked? Well, as we see from your slide 39, in his Life of Plotinus, when Porphyry describes how he edited the Enneads of his master Plotinus, Porphyry writes that he wrote a commentary, or rather a series of commentaries, hypomnemata in Greek, on the Enneads of Plotinus. In fact, more specifically, he says that he wrote them bit by bit as my comrades, my fellow students, asked me to clarify specific points for them. So, there almost certainly was in circulation in Greek a series of probably quite brief essays by Porphyry explaining the Enneads of Plotinus. Now, what physical form might these commentaries have taken? Well, I think that they are likely to have taken the same form that scholia take in Greek manuscripts, and that is, you have a central text in the middle of the manuscript, as we can see from our slide number 40, 14th century manuscript of Aristotle's category. Here you see you have the text in the middle, and all around, well, in this case on 3 sides, but it's often on all 4 sides, you have scholia, you have commentaries. So now imagine, if you will, that the Arabic translator had before him something more or less similar to this format. Obviously, this is a very late manuscript. The manuscript used by the Arabic translators would have been 7 centuries earlier. Something similar in format to this manuscript. It's not always easy to tell who wrote what. Where does the commentary end? Where does the original text end and the commentary begin? And it could be that our writer, our translator, I Bodnár, working in the 830s in Baghdad, was not particularly concerned between distinguishing what Plotinus said and what the commentator said. So my hypothesis is that he just might have copied down the whole shebang, Plotinus's text, Porphyry's hypomnemata, Porphyry's commentaries on the Enneads of Plotinus. And so the result in our Arabic translation of the Theology of Aristotle is that we have a combination of Plotinus's texts followed by explanatory comments interspersed, rather, with Porphyry's explanatory comments on the meaning of the text of Plotinus. And after all this has been done, after the translator Ibn Naima has carried out this translation from a manuscript like this, we have an editor, Al-Kindi in this case, who will have come along afterwards and sort of tried to polish things up, put things together, introduce transitional phrases, introduce some phrases that give the work a more Islamic slant, perhaps introducing some Islamic formulae, and polishing up things after all. So that, in a nutshell, is the way I think that the Theology of Aristotle came into existence. That's not the mainstream view, and in fact I'm not aware of anybody else who holds it right now, but it's what I think, and I have a couple of articles in press on the subject. Okay, well, what I've talked about so far now is nothing new. My students at the Panamericana have heard me say this before, and as I said, it's a lot of this is in press. What I want to briefly conclude with now is a series of comments that is new. I haven't publicly presented any of this material before. So, your slide number 41, Porphyry and Aresi. So, we know the complex story of Iamblichus's work, known as, in Latin, as the De Mysteriis. Right? We've recently had a talk in this series by the eminent Professor Ayala, one of the world's leading authorities on Iamblichus, so I won't be teaching you anything new here. I'll just briefly remind you of what current scholarship thinks about this mysterious work, the De Mysteriis. Current scholarship holds that, first of all, we have Porphyry, who writes a letter to an Egyptian priest named Anebo, asking him about some aspects of theurgy, right? The doctrine, the Iamblician doctrine that concerns primarily the animation of statues and the means by which the gods can be induced to do our bidding. So, Porphyry writes this rather critical, rationalistic critique of theurgy to Anebo. Following that, Iamblichus, who is usually considered to have been a student of Porphyry, writes a rather ferocious response under the pseudonym of Abamon. So he's sort of donning the guise of an Egyptian prophet, an Egyptian teacher, defending Anebo and defending the doctrine of theurgy, basically, in a rather, what shall I say, pedantic and professorial tone, which is surprising for someone who's supposed to have been Porphyry's student, but there are some doubts about whether or not the De Mysteriis is actually by Iamblichus. I won't, and whether Iamblichus was actually the student of Porphyry. I won't enter into details here. Partly because I'm not an expert on Iamblichus. So, in any case, let's return from that to what the Arabic tradition says about the De Mysteriis. And here in our slide 42, we see that one of the main sources of our knowledge about what books existed in Arabic antiquity, what translations were made, is the bibliography, the Firhist, given by the great bibliographer Ibn al-Nadim. Ibn al-Nadim tells us that Porphyry wrote 2 books to Anebo, Kitabani ila Nabu. I don't believe that we know of anything in the Greek tradition that corresponds to this. So that's in his section on Porphyry. That's what Nadim says when he comes to giving the bibliography of Porphyry. Then, when it comes to writing the bibliography of Razi, Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, the heterodox Islamic scholar and doctor who died about 925. According to Ibn al-Nadim, Razi wrote a book which is entitled On the Refutation of Anebo's Work to Porphyry, commenting on the teachings of Aristotle on theology. كتاب في النقد كتاب نابو إلى فرفريوس في شرح مذاهب أرسطاطاليس في العلم الإلهي. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, as we can see on slide 43, it looks as though, according to Ibn al-Nadim, Razi wrote a book that criticized Anebo's letter to Porphyry. This is enough to make us raise our eyebrows a little, because as far as I know, neither in the Greek nor the Latin tradition do we have any information that Porphyry's letter to Anebo was preceded by a letter from Anebo to Porphyry. How can we explain this? Well, here's the interpretation of the German scholar Franz Altheim. And this is buried in a 7-volume work he wrote called Geschichte der Hunnen, the history of the Huns. And if this doctrine of Altheim's, or rather this explanation of Altheim's, has not, as far as I know, been taken up by any contemporary scholar, and that may well be because not many people would expect to find it in a history of the Huns. Anyway, here's what Altheim has to say on this passage, on this title by Razi. Altheim believes that the story went as follows. First of all, we have Anebo, supposedly an Egyptian priest, perhaps really an Egyptian priest, who wrote to Porphyry, asking him questions about Aristotelian theology. Then Porphyry wrote a reply to Anebo, which consisted in 2 books. In book 1, Porphyry discussed Aristotle's theology, and according to Altheim, that quotation that we saw from Sharastani back a few slides ago comes from this book 1 of Porphyry's letter to Anebo. And it's in book 2 of the letter to Anebo that Porphyry raised his questions about theurgy in Egyptian theology, and when Iamblichus wrote what is now known as the De Mysteriis, he was replying to this book 2 of Porphyry's letter to Anebo. Okay, so that's Altmann's interpretation, and I believe that although it hasn't really been taken up by anybody as far as I know, I think it's the one that makes the most sense. So, what about this question here that we see on slide 45? might Razi's work have had something to do with the theology of Aristotle? This question has been discussed by at least one scholar, F.E. Peters, in 1979, and Peters discussed this proposition, this possibility, but was quick to dismiss it on two grounds. First of all, and here I quote from Peters, neither the Greek reconstruction of the letter to Anibo nor the analysis of Iamblichus's response guides us even remotely in the direction of the metaphysics. Remember that Razi's title mentions the theology of Aristotle. Second, writes Peters, the letter to Anibo was written long before Porphyry arranged the essays of Plotinus into the Enneads, and so prior to any possibility of commenting upon them. Fair enough. What are we to make of this argument? Well, slide 46, as far as Peters' first point is concerned, we do not have the Greek text of Anibo's letter to Porphyry. It isn't even mentioned in Greek or Latin. And as far as Porphyry's response to Anibo is concerned, all we have are the fragments which people have selected from Iamblichus's De Mysteriis, which means that all we can rely on in our reconstitution of the letter to Anibo is what Iamblichus chose to quote from it. So, if we're going to base an argument on what is lacking from Porphyry's letter to Anibo, we had better be very careful, because this is an argument e silentio, right? And such arguments don't really prove anything. What about Peter's second point? Slide 47. Well, I think it's very much weaker. As we've seen already, we don't really have any idea about when Porphyry wrote the letter to Anibo, at what stage in his career. Second, even if we did know that this letter is part of an early work by Porphyry, why on earth should we suppose that Porphyry would have to wait until he edited the Enneads 30 years after Plotinus' death? Plotinus dies in 270, and Porphyry is writing, when he describes how he put together the Enneads, he's writing in about 301. So here, according to Peters, Porphyry would have had to wait 30 years before commenting on the Enneads. Slide 48. Well, in my view, that's just absurd. We have no reason whatsoever to believe that. As I mentioned before, when Porphyry is describing how he put together the Enneads, he mentions that he put together hypomnemata, he added commentaries, hypomnemata, and I quote, "We wrote commentaries on some of them without any order, because friends urged us to write on the points they wanted cleared up from them." Now we know perfectly well that long before Plotinus' death, and long before Porphyry edited the Enneads, individual treatises of Plotinus' Enneads were in circulation. Longinus, Porphyry's former teacher, writes to Plotinus and requests some of these treatises during Plotinus' death prior to 270. So there's no reason to believe that Porphyry would have had to wait. Now, according to Christina d'Ancona, Porphyry probably wrote these hypomnemata, these little commentaries on selected passages of the Enneads, sometime between 263 and 270, that is to say, the 6 years when Porphyry was a student at Plotinus' school. So, why is that important? Well, note that, in slide 49, note that Porphyry tells us that he wrote these explanatory essays, quote, because friends urged us to write on the points they wanted cleared up for them, unquote. Now this, I would argue, might be a potential explanation for the apparently chaotic nature of the Theology of Aristotle. It leaps from one topic to another, from one part of the Enneads to another, sometimes breaks off in the middle of a passage, and then it goes from Ennead 4 to Ennead 1 and back to Ennead 5. Doesn't seem to make any sense. But what if the current state of the theology of Aristotle, its structure, represents the fact that the topics that are commented on in it are precisely the ones that Porphyry's friends found difficult and asked him to explain. That's, I can't prove that, but it's just a selection. It's just a suggestion. It might explain why some parts of the Enneads are commented on and why others are not. Of course, in a sense, that doesn't explain anything, because we would not know why Porphyry's colleagues, fellow students, found these particular passages difficult. But anyway, it's one attempt at an explanation. So we're on the home stretch now. I just want to mention one last series of considerations. This is your slide 50. This is very, very speculative. I'm just working on this now, and I have a lot of work to do on it still. Now, we saw very earlier on that there are two versions of the Theology of Aristotle. They're the ones that scholars work on. There is the one, that scholars work on today. It's the short version, and it's the one edited by Abdurrahman Badawi. However, there's also a longer version. This longer version is preserved only in a Hebrew translation, which has never been published and therefore hasn't been studied. What does exist, however, and what has been a little bit studied, but not very much, is a Latin translation made from the Hebrew by a certain Jacobus Carpuntarius, who is in fact a Jacques Charpentier, lived in the 16th century and was the physician to King Charles IX and professor of mathematics at the Collège de France in Paris. Now, in this Latin translation, the title given to the Theology of Aristotle is as follows. In translation, the title is Aristotle's 14 Books on the More Secret Part of Wisdom According to the Egyptians. And if you turn to slide 51, you'll see a couple of not very good photographs of the 1605 edition here. Comes from my own personal collection. So there are certain resemblances between these three texts, I think. If you turn to slide 52, I've got a comparative table here. All right, so we have, side by side, the title of Razi's work, according to Ibn al-Landim, on the refutation of Anibo's work to Porphyry, commenting on the teachers of Aristotle on theology. Okay, fair enough. Now we have the Latin title of the long version of the Theology of Aristotle, Aristotle's 14 Books on the More Secret Part of Wisdom According to the Egyptians. So what we have in common between these two is Aristotle. Right? And then we have Iamblichus, who the title of whose work, De Mysteriis, at least according to one manuscript family, is Iamblichus of Chalcis against Porphyry on the Theology of the Egyptians. So, if you compare these three titles, you have elements that seem to keep coming up. And these elements include, the elements that all three of them have in common they all have something to do with Aristotle, with the Theology of Aristotle, and they have to do with something about the theology of the Egyptians. Now, I'm perfectly aware that this doesn't prove anything. It is a mere, in my view, these resemblances are merely suggestive. As I say in my conclusion on page 53. They do not constitute definitive proof of Porphyry's partial or complete authorship of the Theology of Aristotle, nor do I make any claim to know the nature and contents of Razi's work, which is unfortunately lost. With a little luck, perhaps it lies in some unconsulted manuscript in some library of the Islamic world, and it may come to light someday. I doubt it, but you never know. However, when combined with all the other evidence that we've seen in this presentation, I think it is somewhat hard to believe that these three works had nothing whatsoever to do with one another. And that's about all I have to say on the topic for now. Thank you very much for your attention. So let's move on to seeing any questions that we may have. I want to, before I move on to the questions, I want to remind you to stay tuned next week, because there will be obviously another contribution to the series of Emanaciones Plotinianas. The next will be Maestro Gabriel Nares, who will be speaking on Teología Trinitaria y Metafísica en De Generatione Divini Verbi de Mario Victorino. And I'm sure that that will be a very interesting presentation. All right. So I will now proceed to go through a few of the questions. Sajjad Rizvi is kind enough to say that the Porphyry thesis makes a lot of sense. That is very important for me, coming from a scholar of the eminence of Sajjad Rizvi, who's probably the world's leading expert on Iranian philosophy. And in Iran, in the school of philosophy in Iran that flourished throughout the 14th to the 17th centuries, and still continues today to a certain extent, among people like Mullah Sadra, the Theology of Aristotle is absolutely crucial. Mullah Sadra quotes this work all the time. Luis Rangel asks, it is interesting to know that in the Platiniana Arabica, the first principle is considered at the level of being. But then it indicates that God is in all things. Can one think of pantheism, or must one think of the equivalence between God and the intelligible? Okay, well, this is an interesting question on several levels. The first principle is considered at the level of being. Yes, for Porphyry, at any rate, and for the Platiniana Arabica, the first principle just is being, right? That's what the first principle is. It is being. Does that indicate that God is in all things? Well, no more and no less, I guess, than any Neoplatonic doctrine, than any doctrine of emanation. Right? Every Neoplatonic doctrine presumes that there is an emanation of reality from the one. So there is a similarity in that extent, and although it gets a bit problematic when we come down to the level of matter, because obviously the emanation that begins with the highest intelligible realities and continues through all the different levels of reality in the Neoplatonic scheme, the nous, the intellect, the psyche, the soul, nature, and then matter, the divine emanation gradually becomes weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker until it becomes a problem. Well, to what extent precisely is God present in, quote unquote, matter? Plotinus sometimes speaks as though matter is an independent principle and constitutes evil. But then other times he says something else. So I don't think that this Porphyrian doctrine is, from this viewpoint, is either more problematic or more easy as far as the question of pantheism is concerned. There is a difference between the first principle and the rest of the world, but there is also a similarity. As far as the equivalence between God and the intelligible, well, no, not at all. By no means. Porphyry, although in the commentary on the Parmenides he says that God is being, he also says that God cannot be understood by rational thought of any kind. The only way the being that is God can be known is by a kind of rationality that is more properly characterized as ignorance. This first principle can be thought only by a hyper-rationality that is in fact equivalent to ignorance. And this doctrine is taken up in Maimar 2 of the Theology of Aristotle. From Alexa, we have a question. So, the fact that there is a cause does not imply the temporality of it. There can be causes out of time, absolutely. Absolutely, that's precisely what the texts we have studied are saying. Like God, which is cause just ontologically, not temporarily. Well, temporarily, I guess she means. Absolutely. That's exactly what's being said here. And as I said, this is a reaction on the part of the Neoplatonists against the doctrine of creation in time. And their solution is to say, is the doctrine of continuous creation, the doctrine of eternal creation, which in their view eliminates, sidesteps, resolves all the problems that are faced by a doctrine that says that God did create in time. What was he doing before? Why did he choose to create just then? And so forth. We also have another question from Luis Angel. If Aristotle's theology is a mix between Platonian doctrine, Porphyrian comments, and the interpretation of the Arab copyist or philosopher, did any Arab author really read first-hand some original text by any Neoplatonic philosopher? Interesting question. First-hand, in the sense of there being a complete translation from Greek into Arabic of an actual Neoplatonic writing. All I can say is none of such writings have survived, if there were any. None such translations have survived. The sources that we have, people like Ibn al-Nadim, the bibliographer, tell us that there were translations of a few Neoplatonic writings, some of which are not attested in Arabic, in Greek rather. We read of Porphyry's commentaries on the Nicomachean Ethics, for instance, which are supposed to have been influential on Farabi. Nothing whatsoever is said of such a work in Greek. We know of comments by Olympiodorus on the Theaetetus, and quite a few works are mentioned in these bibliographies written by Arabic writers. Now, did they actually exist? We can't be absolutely certain because they haven't survived. But I think yes, probably they did. It looks as though some of Proclus's commentary on the Timaeus and on the Republic survived, and was read to some extent in Arabic translation, but we can never be sure whether we actually have to do with complete translations or extracts or what have you. For instance, in the Arabic bibliographers that I've mentioned, you often find the statement that several Platonic dialogues were translated. They give the names of the translators and so forth, the Laws, the Timaeus, many others. In fact, however, modern scholarship tends to believe that no Platonic dialogue was ever completely translated into Arabic. What was translated were the epitomes, the summaries that Galen wrote of these doctrines. So even if you see in the Arabic sources, the bibliographers, this explicit notice here, I have seen this translation of this commentary by Olympiodorus, you have to be careful. You can never be 100% sure until and unless they actually turn up, and they have not turned up. Now, we do have a couple of writings which have been published. They are anonymous in the manuscript, but modern scholars have attributed them to Iamblichus and Proclus. In particular, there are two commentaries on the Golden Verses by Pythagoras, which modern scholars have attributed to Iamblichus and to Proclus. I have my doubts. They don't look to me like they are by either Proclus or Iamblichus, but I could be wrong. Regina Garcia-Villa asks, will this material be ready in grabación, en material? I guess so. You would have to ask the administrators about that. Here we go. Already, it has been, Luis Angel has answered, and the answer is yes. So, Luis Angel also answers, how were the mystery or theurgical texts read in the Arabic interpretation? Another very interesting question. Difficult to know. First of all, we're not 100% sure that such works were transmitted to the Arab world. I personally think it's highly likely that they were. Here we're getting into the question of sort of the. Let me take a step back. Basically, we're talking about two different kinds of transmission of Neoplatonic material to the Arabic world. We have the philosophical treatises, right? Some commentaries of Simplicius, commentaries of Damascus, and so forth, which I have suggested may have been translated into Persian and thence into Arabic. Then we have what is known, what could be called occultist material, material on astrology, material on alchemy. Some of this is likely to have originated in theurgist material. Now, what we do have, we have occultist Islamic materials, much of which originated in Haran, this town in Mesopotamia, where it is believed by some that the last Neoplatonists may have settled and taught. We have, for instance, a treatise on the generation of human beings attributed to none other than Porphyry. It contains, among other things, a recipe of how to make a little human being in a jar. And the great scholar Paul Krauss, who wrote this wonderful book on Jabir ibn Hayyan, I don't know if you can see that. Whoops. Yeah, there we go. Jabir ibn Hayyan. Anyway, Krauss points out that this book, this attributed to Porphyry, probably comes from a treatise by Porphyry where he discussed the animation of statues, that is to say, theurgy. And that got something got lost in translation, and you wind up with an Islamic treatise on the generation of a human being, how to create a homunculus. But all this is very, very difficult to study. And over the past generation or so, more attention has begun to be paid to Islamic occultist writings, and we need to work very much more on this question because it's very difficult, very hard to figure out what's going on there. Charles Carvajal asks, what can you say of the originist input on Plotinian works that made it to the Arabic world? The originist input on Plotinian's works, well, there's none. If we have Plotinus, there's no particular reason to invoke the name of Origen at all, who was, I don't know why we would, quite frankly. The influence of Plotinus and of Porphyry are quite sufficient to explain all the Plotinian-sounding doctrines, I think, in these works that we've been discussing. Now, I realize that there are some people who see, I've been accused of seeing Porphyry under every mattress, and there are other authors who see Origen under every mattress. They see him as the main source of the Pseudo-Dionysius. They see him, people like Ilaria Romelli see him as the main source behind people like Evagrius of Pontus, which is probably quite right, but also like people like Bardaisan, a Syrian writer. And I think that all that is somewhat exaggerated. For me, it's crystal clear that Origen has very little to do with a work like the Pseudo-Dionysius, who all you need to do is look at Proclus, and that explains what you find in the Pseudo-Dionysius. No need to invoke another source. Now, it is true that this question is complicated by the fact that there were two Origins in antiquity. One, the Christian church father that everybody knows, and the other, someone that we know very little about, named Origen the Pagan, who appears to have been a fellow student of Plotinus at the school of Ammonius Saccas. So, now the great scholar Willy Tyler once said that where you have a doctrine that on the one hand appears in Origen, the Christian, and on the other appears in Porphyry, but does not appear in Plotinus, then, according to Willi Tyler, we have to do with the doctrines of Ammonius Saccas, about whom we know very little. So all these are very difficult doctrines, but the question remains open. That said, originist doctrines in Plotinian works that make it to the Arabic world? No, none. Originist doctrines on works in general that made it to the Arabic world? Quite a bit, because some of the works that made it to the Arabic world were the writings of the Desert Fathers. Right? The Christian Desert Fathers, working in the tradition of Evagrius of Pontus, people like Diadochus of Photike. There you have a ton of originist material filtered through Evagrius, and a lot of this material will have been known to Arabic-speaking Christians. And personally, I believe that a lot of this material may be at the origin, one of the sources of origin of the mystical current of Islamic thought known as Sufism. So that is an entirely other story, needless to say. Okay, then, does anyone have any other questions? Comments? I see, by the way, that Luis has posted the Google Drive link now for all these materials, for those who may be interested. Okay, no other questions? Then I will perhaps thank you for your attention once again, renew my thanks to Luis and to Alexa for this organization. Remind you to keep on tuning in to Emanaciones Plotinianas, and be sure to tune in next week for Maestro Nares' very interesting presentation on Marius Victorinus, who, by the way, has also been, it has been proposed by Pierre Hadot that Marius Victorinus himself was very heavily influenced by the commentary of Porphyry on the Parmenides, the one in which he sets forth the doctrine of the first principle as being. But I'm sure that Maestro Nares will tell you much more about this next week. Thank you all for your attention, and goodbye. Have a great weekend. I'm sorry, the weekend's over. Have a great week then, and keep safe.